and we're grateful that we can be here to study your word. As we open your word this morning, may we gain a blessing, and may each one hearing your word also gain a blessing. Fill us with knowledge and understanding as we study this morning. We pray in your name, amen. Well, we're on the flood this morning, and this morning our memory text is found in Matthew 24:37. And Dick, if you'd like to read that for us this morning.
But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Matthew 24:37.
Well, having studied the days of Noah, and then reading that so will the coming of the Son of Man be, it really makes you think we're there, doesn't it?
It sure does.
It really does. In our lesson it said, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And I think all you have to do is open the newspaper or turn on any news station you choose to listen to, and you would think we are there. As we get into it this morning, it goes into God's, on Sunday, preparation for the flood. And let's turn to Genesis 6:13, and we're going to start. Let's just read a few, Genesis 6:13, and we're going to go through 7:10.
Okay.
And if you want to read, and then I'll start once we get into 7. How's that?
Okay. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark. Cover it inside and outside with pitch. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, and its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. You shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in its side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. And behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark. You, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 for every sort into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, and every creeping thing of the earth after its kind, 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. And you shall take for yourselves of all the food that is eaten, and you shall gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them. Thus Noah did according to all that God commanded him, so he did.
And we'll go to 7, verse 10. And actually, I'm going to read 1 through 10, because 7:10 just kind of jumps ahead there. Then the Lord said to Noah, come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. You shall take with you 7 each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female. Also 7 each of the birds of the air, male and female, to keep the species alive on the face of all the earth. For after 7 more days I will cause it to rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made. And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth. So Noah with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives went into the ark because of the waters of the flood. Of clean animals, of animals that are unclean, of birds, and of everything that creeps on the earth. 2 by 2 they went into the ark, to Noah, male and female. as God had commanded Noah. And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were on the earth. That brings us up to verse 10. There's a lot packed into those few verses, isn't there? In our lesson, it says, what can we learn from this amazing account of early Earth's history? And we talked about how the earth was filled with violence, for one thing.
Well, I think one thing we learn that evil gets its reward.
Evil,
doesn't
yeah.
pay in the long run, even though sometimes in the short term it seems to.
Yeah.
Another thing is that in spite of the fact that God said he was going to destroy the earth, his real goal was to save the earth. Back when we started here in verse 13, it says, and God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me. A lot of people interpret that as, I'm going to destroy it all.
Right.
But I think what he's really saying is, if I don't do something, they're going to kill each other off.
Yeah, good point.
And so then he finds Noah as the man to save humanity and puts him to work.
And you know, we're told at the end of time there will be those lost that number the sands of the sea, for example. When you think back of Noah's time, how many people were saved?
Well, 8 were saved in the ark. But something we don't talk about much is what happened during that 120 years he was building the ark. I can't believe that he preached for 120 years about the coming flood and had 0 converts. But probably the people that were converted, a few, though they may have been, probably died off before the 120 years were up. So I think that there were people that were touched by Noah's message and will be saved, but they weren't saved in the ark.
Well, that's a good point, but they weren't saved in the ark, yes. Just like we're told, in last days there will be those that will be laid to rest. And so when you think of how many people populated the earth at that time probably, and that's all that were saved on the ark to repopulate the earth, that's kind of mind-boggling. Really is. The other thing is when you were reading the divine instructions, the exact size, the exact dimensions, the way the ark was to be built.
I don't think anybody had ever built a boat that big before, and we don't have any record of what Noah's occupation had been. He probably wasn't a shipbuilder.
Yeah.
And so God had to give him very explicit instructions on how to do it.
Years ago when I taught I believe it was either the primary or juniors. I think it was junior age kids. We did and I should have looked up the stuff, but we did an intense study about Noah and the ark and all of this that took place. And one of the things that in something that we had come across was the dimensions that God designed this had to do with the waves, because it was a flat bottom boat. And so it had to do with the waves so that it would keep it from tipping over.
Actually, there have been some engineering studies done, and the proportions of the ark, width, length, and height, are the perfect proportions for stormy seas.
Exactly.
Now, today they build these big tankers that are much longer than the width because they'll carry more cargo at a low cost that way. But it's not really the safest way to build a ship.
And the ones nowadays have engines. This had no engine.
Yeah, that's true
so
too.
It was designed to withstand all of that, which I thought was very interesting. This same group of kids, all those years ago, I belonged to the Denver West Church at that time, and the whole front of our church was huge piece of land. I don't remember how much land total we had. And so the kids and I staked it all out and did a whole thing of the size. That's how big the piece of property was, that we could stake it out the size of the ark.
Of course, if anybody ever gets a chance to be passing through Kentucky, they have built what they think is a full-size replica of the ark there. However, there's one thing about that. The measurements are given in cubits, and we don't really know what they considered a cubit. Now, we consider a cubit from the fingertips to the elbow.
But your cubit and my cubit might be different.
Right. And back in those days, how long, people think, we don't know, that man was probably considerably larger before the flood. And if that was true, the cubit might have been larger.
That's true.
Also.
That's true.
Now, we figure 18 inches for a cubit, but the Romans used a different cubit, an imperial cubit, that was 20.6 inches long. And if you used those measurements, I wrote it down here someplace, 515 feet long instead of the 450 that we usually consider it, and 86 wide and 52 feet high instead of 75 and 45.
Yeah.
So the boat may have been even bigger than the one they have there in Kentucky.
And either way, it was a pretty good-sized boat.
Either way, pretty
Yeah.
big. When we walked through that, we were able to see how easily they could care for so many animals in it. And two things, people wonder how do you store that many animals and enough food for them. I wonder if many of these animals didn't go into a state of hibernation during the flood.
I have heard people mention that.
So they wouldn't need as much food.
Mm-hmm.
And also, there's nothing that says these were all full-sized animals. They could have been juveniles that wouldn't need as big a space.
That's possible, too.
So, we don't know how God did it, but God's smart enough to figure out the way that's going to work best.
Exactly. And the other thing we get in these lessons, we come up with the God established a covenant. Now, in the past, we've gone over several studies where we've talked about covenants. And this is the first time that word, if I'm correct, this is the first time that word covenant was used in this relationship. Another thing that there are those who think that this was just a local flood. And it makes it very clear that it covered the entire earth. So it was a complete destruction of everything. And in one of the Bible commentaries that I was reading, it talks about it was 22 feet over the highest mountain on the earth at that time. So, that was a lot of water.
And again, that depends on the size of the cubit. It may have been even higher than that.
It's true. That's true. Now, in the lesson, it talks about an ark. What else do we know about an ark when we...
Well, there were two different types of arks, but I think what you're probably wanting me to say is that Moses was saved in an ark. His mother made a basket and lined it with pitch so it wouldn't leak. And they placed it out there on the Nile River and among the bulrushes along the shore where the princess found it. And so Moses didn't suffer the death penalty that most Hebrew children were suffering at that time.
And then we know of another ark, the Ark of the Covenant. And the interesting thing is they all are similar in that they all are a covering for something, like a storage, a protection. Exactly. In our lesson, it talks about the parallels to the Ark of the Tabernacle, just as the Ark of the Flood will permit the survival of humankind, so the Ark of the Covenant, a sign of God's presence in the midst of his people, points to God's work of salvation for his people. And just like we know Moses' ark was also a protection and protected him. In our lesson, it brings out Noah did according to all that God commanded. And you think of, I think you had mentioned 120 years of building the ark and the constant barrage of being tormented They had never seen a flood. They had never seen rain. The earth was filled with, the dew came at night and watered the earth. So they had never seen this. I really have to think God's protection over Noah as he's doing this, 120 years of this, you'd get tired of hearing it, We keep thinking, well, it says he's going to come. We're living in the last days. Well, how long do we have to wait? Our parents and our parents and our parents before them waited, So you think God had to have a special protection for him and that encouragement. God gave Noah the exact dimensions of the ark and explicit directions in regard to its construction in every particular. Human wisdom could not have devised a structure of so great of strength and durability. God was the designer and Noah was the master builder. And that's found in Patriarchs and Prophets. It also mentioned in the thing that Noah found grace in God's eyes. What do you understand that to mean?
Well, what is grace? I guess we need a definition for grace to start with. Mercy is when we don't receive the penalty for the things we do wrong. But grace is when we get a reward that we don't deserve.
That we don't deserve, yeah.
And so, there's maybe no special reason why Noah should have been saved, but God chose to save him. He showed grace.
Yeah, because if all have sinned and all fall short of the glory of God, we know that he too was a sinner. And how about the fact that his sons and their wives and his wife were all saved? It doesn't say that God found,
Of course, it doesn't say that he didn't.
It doesn't say that he didn't either. Yeah.
But there is some truth to that our lives can be a benefit to those around us.
Mm-hmm. Let's go on to Monday, the event of the flood. I thought it was interesting in this one, it brought out Noah's acts of obedience to God are like God's acts of creation. And in our, there's a study book that goes along with our lesson. One of the things that it talked about in here was the reversal of creation. It says, because God repents of having created, he understandably decides to reverse his creation. Have you ever heard of it called that, a reverse of creation?
Well, that was a term I hadn't seen before this lesson, but it's true.
It is, yeah.
I've heard mothers say to their children, I brought you into this world, I'll take you out of it. And that's sort of the
exactly. The reversal is already suggested linguistically through the play on words between the verb nakham, and I'm probably destroying these, and that's okay, which means to destroy, and that's in Genesis 6:7, and the word nakham, which means comfort, and that's in Genesis 5:29, which will be repeated with the sense of story. In Hebrew, the main radicals of the two words have been reversed. The imka, or makah, to kamma. In addition, the narration of the flood event follows the creation story in reverse order. I'm going to try to do this so that you can understand this without seeing it. I'm sorry. So on this, day 6, land, animals, and humans. The flood begins where creation ends, on the 6th day. The listing of Genesis 7, 7 and 8, humans, beasts, and birds, is in reverse order from the creation account, birds, beasts, and humans. And until I read this in here, I never noticed everything about it is in reverse. Fish are omitted from for the obvious reason that swimming fish will survive the waters of the flood. Day 5, waters and birds. Whereas in the creation account, the waters and heavens produce life. In the flood account, the waters bring destruction. And that's found in verses 10 through 12. Day 4, stars, sun, and moon. Whereas in the creation account, the sun and the moon are set up to give light, in the flood account, the heavens are covered. Verses 18 and 20. Day 3, dry land. Whereas in the creation account, the waters are separated to allow plants to grow, in the flood account, all that was on the dry land died. Day 2, the firmament and separation of waters. At this stage, God remembers and the process of creation returns. And that's found in Genesis 8, 1 through 3. And then on day 1, life over the waters. While in the creation account, the Spirit is over the waters and light is created, in the flood account, the dove flies over the water and Noah opens the windows. I'm sure in pastor's sermons, and if you ever study with him, he talks a lot about chiastic structures. And in Genesis, there are many of them, and this being kind of one of them, where it starts and it ends, you know. And it really brought that out in several places. In different Bible study books that you go over, it really brings out those chiastic structures. So humanity's survival was due strictly to divine grace. No human effort at all. I mean, if that would have been the case, Noah and his family wouldn't have made it either.
Yeah, you know, if Noah had just undertaken this boat on his own and tried to save himself, I don't believe that he would have survived the flood. God had his hands over that boat and protected it during the entire time that they were on the water.
Yes.
And, you know, we when we talk about the flood, we often think about 40 days and 40 nights of the rain. But they were on the boat for over a year.
Over a year. It was like 400 and some days, I think it was.
Well, you know, they were on it for a week before the flood came, and then they were on it for an entire year and a day before they were able to get off.
Yeah. You're right, because I think, and so many times, even when, as a child in the lower division classes, you learn 40 days and 40 nights, and there's all kinds of little songs that go along with it. But you don't understand how long that was. I mean, you figure not only for the humans, but for the animals. God had to have had some type of, like you mentioned, maybe a deep sleep on some of them, a longer rest, whatever. And had it been humans, they wouldn't have known how much food and water to take on board, whereas God told them exactly how much they were to need. So this helps reveal that the God who creates is the same God who destroys. And that's found in Deuteronomy. The flood is designed to be a new creation out of the waters, which leads to a new existence. On Tuesday's lesson, the end of the flood, and we talked about how it destroyed everything. Would you go to Genesis 7, 22 through 24.
Genesis 7, starting at verse 22.
22 through 24.
All in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, all that was on dry land died. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days.
Okay. Do you suppose that with that length of time, Noah thought he had been forgotten?
I don't know.
To be shut up and everything, you wonder, it doesn't say that God spoke with them anytime during that time, or the other thing, they might have been kept so busy that they didn't even realize how time was passing. But God had not forgotten them. In 8:1 it says, "Then God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark."
You know, that God remembered Noah. Some people take that to mean it's like he'd forgotten about him. And then, oh yeah, Noah, I better go deal with him. I don't think it means that. We remember things in the sense that we never forget.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think God ever forgot Noah. So God remembered Noah all the way through the flood, not just now suddenly at the end of it.
Well, and
But
like you
now
had
was
just
the
mentioned,
time that he acted.
yeah, he had his protection over them that whole time. And I think it brought out that God had not forgotten them, but was actually caring for them. Yeah. And acting on their behalf. Would you look up Genesis 30:22, and I'm going to look up Exodus 6:5 pertaining to this.
30:22?
30:22, I think it is.
Okay. And God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb.
Now, once again, do you think God had forgotten her? Or, she had been praying about this. She had wanted a child. But it was God's timing, wasn't it? Okay, and Exodus 6:5. And I have also heard the groanings of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians kept in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. And once again, I don't think God ever forgot his covenant. I don't think God was so busy that, oh yeah, I have a covenant with those people. That's not at all. When we think of the word remember, we get into a totally different thought pattern. And so it says, he fulfills his promise at the appointed time. And just like with the Israelites and like with Rachel, it was in God's time, wasn't it? It wasn't in their time. Now, after being on the flood this length of time and everything, God remembers them. It means the fulfillment of that promise had taken place. That time span was the exact time span God had planned. Noah goes out only when God tells him to. Now, it doesn't say how long the ark had rested. That they knew they weren't in this kind of a motion anymore. They knew they were on land.
It says the waters prevailed for 150 days. So for 150 days, they were in a stormy sea.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of that 150 days, they came to a calm place. They were still floating in the water.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it also, doesn't it say something about when the boat rested, that the boat actually became grounded?
Mm-hmm.
And then they still stayed until God said to leave. And when he said to leave, it was after 371 days.
Yeah.
And you can compute that from the information they give you here in the story. So, it doesn't compute it for you. The information's there if you dig.
Yeah, exactly. But the fact is, he didn't go out of the ark after it rested on the land. Because even though it was resting on the land, it had to have been a muddy mess out there. And he didn't just decide on his own, hey, I think it's time, let's turn these animals loose. It was all God's appointed time. In Genesis 8:16, it says, "Then God spoke to Noah, saying, 'Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and cattle, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth.'" So Noah went out with his sons and his wife, and his sons' wives with him, every animal, every creeping thing, every bird, and whatever creeps on the earth, according to their families, went out of the ark. Now, another thing that it brought out in this, and I may be jumping ahead of myself, in the ark, that length of time, there was probably not a fear, because we don't read that there was a fear of these animals. They had to take care of these animals. But what happened afterward?
Well, of course, before the flood, God had given man dominion over the animals,
Yeah.
and I don't think we had wild animals that we had to be afraid of. But after the flood, because some of these animals were so large, God put a fear of man into the animals, and we still see that today. Even little birds that have never been exposed to a person before, when they see a person, they move away.
They scatter. And you bringing up birds made me think, after studying this, I was looking at my bird feeder area, and you see all the different size birds out there. They're, there's quail and little sparrows and whatnot, and they're not afraid of each other. Now, when it gets into the predator birds, that's another story. But I've watched out there, and you see the birds out there feeding, and here comes a rabbit. They don't scatter when a rabbit comes. But you're right. Step outside there next to them, and everybody's gone. So that was put into them, that fear, but that fear on both sides. One of the things that it brought out, too, was that had to do with the fact that they were all after the same food source, even in the beginning. And I don't remember if that was in the Genesis book that I was reading that, or if it was in one of the other study books. But I thought that was interesting. I had never taken anything like that into account before.
Well, man's original diet was fruit, grains, and nuts. And at the fall, when the ground was cursed, God added vegetables to the diet. Mm-hmm. And while apparently some people were already eating meat, it wasn't God's plan at that time. But after the flood, there weren't many living plants around to provide food. Mm-hmm. It took a while. So God said, okay, now it's okay to eat meat, but He limited it to certain kinds of meat. They brought clean and unclean animals on the ark. Well, if they'd butchered one of the unclean ones, we wouldn't have it today.
Right. And they brought extras of those. They were told to bring extra.
But the clean animals, they brought extra, so
mm-hmm.
they had them for food, and
mm-hmm.
God then gave man the instructions that he could eat the meat.
And it was definite instruction, wasn't it? It asks us, what did Noah do first when he went out of the ark, and why?
Well, he offered sacrifices of all the clean animals, and it was to show his thanksgiving to God for all God had done for him.
And in talking about there's different kinds of sacrifices, isn't there? And this was a thank offering, wasn't it? Like you mentioned, for all the protection and all that God had done. And let's read that in 8:20. Genesis 8:20.
Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord's... how far do you want me to read?
8:20.
Okay.
Yeah. And we'll go on here in just a minute. Of every clean animal. And it said, we were told earlier that they had taken 7 of each clean animal on. So here he's making that first. God's covenant included Noah and his descendants. And here this thank offering for what they had done. The burnt offering taken from among, it didn't just say one of them, it said all of the clean. And so that was birds, that was mammals, all that were clean. The other thing that it brought out in the lesson, it says, like Adam and Eve, who surely worshiped God on Sabbath immediately after the 6 days of creation, Noah worshiped God immediately after the flood. Another creation event in and of itself. There's a difference, however, between the two acts of worship. Unlike Adam and Eve, who worshiped the Lord directly, Noah had to resort to a sacrifice. This is the first mention in the Scripture of an altar. The sacrifice is a burnt offering, the oldest and most frequent sacrifice. For Noah, this sacrifice was a thanksgiving offering, like you had mentioned. And it goes into, in Numbers, it talks about all the different types of sacrifices. So this thanksgiving offering was given in order to express his gratitude, his thankfulness. In Genesis 9, 2 through 4, it asks us, how did the flood affect the human diet? And you kind of alluded to that already. Because they had a vegetarian diet, and because of what was on the ground at this point, God gave them instructions then on what to eat. And let's go to that in Genesis 9, 2 through 4.
And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, and on all that move on the earth, and all the fish of the sea. They are given unto your hand. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Interesting that he puts this restriction on about not eating things with blood in it. The truth is that the blood also carries many of the pathogens that cause disease.
Yeah.
And so it's a health principle as well as whatever reason they thought it was. They thought maybe it was just some kind of a spiritual thing, but it was also, there was a health reason behind it.
Yeah.
And, people that eat meat today, the meat isn't prepared the way God said it was to be prepared, with all the blood drained out of it. A lot of the flavor comes from the blood. If you took a piece of a nice juicy steak, just cut out a little chunk of it and put it in a glass of water and shake it up and keep changing the water until the water doesn't come out pink anymore. Then cook that piece of meat and taste it and see what it tastes like. You wouldn't find meat nearly as appealing to eat.
Probably more like a rubber eraser at that point.
And, while God gave man permission to eat meat, it was because there was a shortage of other things to eat. Now, in this country particularly, we have such a variety of things to eat that I believe the healthiest course now is to revert to the vegetarian diet.
And, you're talking about where it says not to eat the blood. You go to different countries, different nationalities and stuff, and how interesting the eating is different. When I was a kid, we had neighbors next to us that they would do all their own butchering. And one of the things that I remember her doing is she would catch the blood, and the whole time, it's rather gross, I thought, but she would catch it in a pan and stir it with her hand to keep it from coagulating, and she made a blood pudding. It's just, but different nationalities, that is still what they do. And yet we're told that is not what we're to eat. So God gave them, once again, specifics on how to take care of themselves, how to best be healthy. And there we find where you read the fear and the dread of man on animal life. Every moving thing that lives, food, all green herbs, but no lifeblood. I thought that was interesting that it was called lifeblood. Once they started eating each other, humans and animals, no doubt, developed a relationship quite different from what they had enjoyed in Eden. where they were all in the garden, where there wasn't the fear of one another. And all of a sudden now they have the fear of, death. On Thursday's lesson, the covenant part 2, what's the significance of God's commitment to the preservation of life, and how does God's blessing fulfill that commitment?
Well, God cares, and He wants man to survive. His blessing is what makes possible man's existence.
Yeah. Now, when it says that that God smelled a soothing aroma, what is that actually meaning? Does God like the smell of burnt flesh on a grill, for example?
Probably not.
Yeah.
But it was the thought that was behind it.
That's right.
We have some kind of expression about it's the thought, not the gift.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the way it was with God, too.
Yeah, and I think when it's talking about that God smelled that soothing aroma and was pleased, that God accepted that sacrifice because He knew what it took to take that animal's life and sacrifice it. The sacrifice of clean animals, birds, means that was known before the flood. That, for Him to have instructed them to take that many extras on there.
As this goes on, though, it goes into man not shedding blood of other men. Verse 6, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. That's sort of endorsement of capital punishment. In the beginning, when Cain killed Abel,
he had a mark on him.
God didn't destroy Cain, but He gave him a reprieve. And some people point that out as an argument against capital punishment. But as the world population had increased and man became more evil, there seemed to be more need to nip these problems in the bud.
Yeah.
And so now God says, when a man kills another man, he deserves death also.
Yes.
Interesting.
The other thing that came out in this, and that's in 8:21 through 9:1. Another thing that was brought out, well, let's see, we have time. Let's go to 8:21. And that's just kind of continuing on from where you were in a sense. And it's talking about where that God smelled that sweet savor aroma.
I'm sorry, I must have 9:21.
Oh, wait a minute. Did I?
8:21?
8:21 through 9:1.
Okay. And the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. Then the Lord said in His heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth.
Something else that was brought out. Okay, that brought out first what we talked about. God smelled that and accepted that offering. But then you brought out something else. I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from the youth. But then, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter, summer, day and night shall not cease. What is He telling us there? Did any of that change?
Well, of course, we don't know what it was like before, really, but it tells us that man can count on God to continue providing what he needs.
And is that part of that covenant? That will not change.
Yeah,
He will continue,
so.
He will continue making sure that we have day and night, that the earth continues as it is. And then in verse 9:1 it says, "So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth.'" There's that recreation that it talked about. The animals were to do the same thing. The Lord, in a sense, was giving humanity a chance to start over fresh, wasn't it? Be fruitful and multiply. And if we go back to Genesis 1:28, 1:28 says, "Then God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish, the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" So it's a repeat of that creation, isn't it? That they were then to recreate. Then we get into what the covenant was. And what was the covenant that God made with them?
Well, the expressed one right here is the rainbow. Is
Rainbow.
That what you're asking?
Yeah.
Man was concerned, I suppose, that this happened once. Maybe it'll happen again.
Yeah.
And God says, "No, it won't. I promise it won't." And when you see this rainbow and the clouds that come with every storm, you'll know that I remember my promise and it won't completely destroy the earth again. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be local floods, but it does mean that he won't destroy the entire earth with a flood. However, I think the whole point of this story being preserved for us in the Bible is to point out, as it said in the memory verse, "As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the coming of man." The fact is that there's a time coming when God will have to destroy the wicked.
Yes.
And it won't be by flood this time, it'll be by fire.
Right. And there were some things brought out about this flood, about the rainbow. Let's go to Genesis 9:8-17. And I'll read that. "Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, 'And as for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you.'" Does that include us then?
It does.
Absolutely. "And with every living creature that is with you." So who else was that covenant with?
The animals.
The animals, the birds, the cattle, every beast of the earth with you. "All of you that go out of the ark, every beast of the earth. Thus I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant which I have made between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. My rainbow, I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It shall be when I bring a cloud over the earth that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow shall be in the cloud." This is the part I really like. You know, we think of when there's a storm and we look up and we see the beautiful rainbow and we remember. It says, "I will look on it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." And God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." Do you ever stop to think that God looks down on that same rainbow you're looking up at? I just love that. One of the things that was brought out, and I think it may have been in our study book here, where he talks about that the angels even look down upon that rainbow and remember God's covenant with the earth. One of the things that it brought out in here, the rainbow parallels the Sabbath in the creation account. This literary construction has theological significance. The rainbow and the Sabbath are the only two entities identified in the Bible as cosmic signs of the covenant. And I had not thought about that either before. And he brings out in Genesis where it talks about the rainbow appearing in the heavens, encompassing the earth, is the sign of his covenant with his new creation, paralleling the Sabbath in his initial creation. The Sabbath is lived in human time as the sign of his covenant with his people. Both the rainbow and the Sabbath are signs of remembrance. And once again, we talked about him talking about remember. While the Sabbath is a sign that recalls the event of creation from the primary waters, the rainbow is a sign that reminds us of the event of recreation from the waters of the flood. Both Sabbath and the rainbow speak of God's unilateral action of creation toward human. I like the way that he brought that out. He set that bow in the air. It also associates the rainbow. We know of another time that it talks about a rainbow. And where is that? Do you recall? In God's throne room?
Oh, yeah. Apparently a rainbow surrounds the throne.
Yeah. So in heaven, when we see the throne room, when we're able to see that, we'll see that same rainbow, a reminder of that covenant, a perpetual covenant. A perpetual covenant that's going to go on and on until Jesus comes again. Some people argue that Noah's flood was only a local event. What's wrong with that picture?
Well, if it was a local event, why would Noah have needed to build a boat?
Yeah.
God could have just told him, move over to this other place.
Yeah. And he had 120 days to do it, so he could have got somewhere else.
And if it was a local event, it doesn't explain why we find shark's teeth and other marine fossils high up in the mountains. I don't think there's any doubt. I just read something recently on the internet about an area in the northwestern United States that the geography was pretty unexplainable till some guy put together how the flood had affected it.
And in an area like where we live, when you get up above it and you can see the way the land goes, you can literally see where the water resided, and we can find all these different kinds of fossils here that should not be here otherwise.
But I don't know how much more material you had, but I'd like to, if I could have a couple of minutes,
Go ahead.
To talk a little bit about why there was a flood. A lot of people don't understand, why was God so cruel to destroy these people? And I thought of a comparison. Back in 1945, President Truman had probably the heaviest decision to make any president's ever made when he decided to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. And it wasn't something he wanted to do. It wasn't something he took lightly. He agonized over it. But when the bomb was dropped, the first one on Hiroshima, resulted in about 100,000 deaths. Now, over the years, there were some more deaths from radiation poisoning, maybe. But in the first year from the dropping of the bomb, there were about 100,000 deaths. Japan did not give up after that, so we dropped a second one on Nagasaki, was it?
I think it was.
And the amount of damage was less from that one. There weren't as many people. So less than 200,000 people died from the 2 atomic bombs that we dropped. The estimates were, if we made a conventional invasion of Japan, that the United States would have lost between 400,000 and 800,000 men. And, this is the part that really is heavy, Japan would have lost between 5 and 10 million people, both civilians and military. So actually, by dropping those 2 bombs and shortening the war, President Truman saved
lives.
And so when God looked down on the earth and saw the direction that man was headed with his evil ways, he realized the only way to save lives was to destroy some of them. Most of them, in fact, in that case.
Yeah.
And so it's... Some people have trouble relating a loving God to this harsh treatment, but there comes a time when harshness is necessary.
Yeah. You know, if we take just a snippet of what we see taking place now, where they've, in many places, have backed off with, say, police protection, what do we see? Everything goes rampant, and so evil takes over. I think what God did by destroying the evil and just protecting his remnant. And we're told that in the end there will be another remnant that with God's protection around it. So I'm glad he has the plan and he sticks to his plan. Well, we are actually out of time. Would you like to have our closing prayer?
Our Father in heaven, how thankful we are for a loving God who wants only the best for all of his people. We pray that as we go forward from here contemplating this event that's happened in the past, we can apply it to our own situation and prepare ourselves to meet you in the clouds of heaven. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.